Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 15, where we will be talking about gender and the environment. So, what are some of the key questions that we need to address in order to understand the relationship between gender and the environment is some of the societal level policy debates, societal concerns, where does all of the concern come from. So, we will look at all of that in the first part of the lecture, and then we will transition to understanding using a feminist lens what is the idea of ecofeminism and how does it help us understand the relationship between gender and the environment. So, I want to start here with a very powerful reflection by Amartya Sen, where he says that advancing gender equality may be one of the best ways of saving the environment and countering the dangers of overcrowding and other adversities associated with population pressure. The voice of women is critically important for the world's future, not just for women's future. So, you see that in this quote, Sen encapsulates the need for focusing on saving the environment through the lens of gender and through the refocusing the idea of attending to the environment through the idea of women and gender by extension. And we do see that several calls such as this has been taken up as at the international levels, and the United Nations Environmental Program lays out that the fact that gender mediates human environment interactions and all environmental use, knowledge and assessment cannot be ignored, and that gender roles, responsibilities, expectations, norms and the division of labor shape all forms of human relationships to the environment. So, again you see at the international level the concern has been raised, the concern has been addressed to find a solution using the gender lens to address issues of the environment. So then, scholars and policymakers have asked the very important question: what is the relationship between climate change and gender, and how is it treated in policy? So, what are the parameters? What are the indicators that we can use to understand the relationship between gender and climate change? The buzzword that we hear around us, and how is it treated in policy, how is it addressed in terms of social policy, socio-economic policy or international policy. A study that was done in 2007 points out that in a sample of 141 countries over the period of 1981 to 2002, it was found that natural disasters on an average kill more women than men. And as you can see on this graph that if you compare the tsunami deaths in heavily damaged areas compared to the the solid line, which is the male graph, compared to the broken line, which is the female graph, you can see that there is a significant rise, there is a significant increase in the number of deaths when compared to the male curve. So, why is it that if there is a natural disaster, if there is a natural calamity, why does it tend to kill more women than men is the question. And here also you can see an intersectional variation, because here it's shown tsunami damage by age and gender, So it's relatively low at for the young adults 25 to 34, and then it keeps on rising, and then it drops for the 55 to 64, and then it rises once more. So what is happening at these various intersectional levels that we see these changes in the pattern of the graph, and why is it that consistently one line is always recording a higher figure than the other line? So with that, we need to look at how the rules and norms, that is formal and informal constraints that together construct gender, inform the idea of division of labor. So how does a person, how does one understand that how is the division of labor created in society? And it depends on the rules and norms which comes with the formal and informal constraints that construct gender, and this includes the conversation, the the ongoing conversation, and the previous conversations that scholars have been having is with the challenges to equate the biological condition with the social construction of gender. So the division of labor and then influences access to and control over resources. So this is this becomes extremely important, because if you go back to the previous graph here, you will see that much of the time, when the reason that one curve registers higher figure than the other curve is because of the access to and control over resources. So oftentimes it is seen that this access and control over resources is one of the crucial, very significant points with regard to natural calamities, with regard to natural disasters, and how much of death numbers are reported or recorded depends on the access to resources or control over resources. Now all of this actually inform the relationship of people with the environment. So the division of labor of how a society is organized in and in comparison to the access to and control over resources in combination impacts the environment and vice versa. So the environment in return also impacts the access and control over resources and the division of labor. So it's kind of a two-way process. So we see that the UNDP has actually identified a requirement to understand the gender lens in order to understand how can we save the environment. And we see that the idea that climate change gives rise to gender division of labor, which leads to gendered impacts of climate change, and that in return informs the adaptation and mitigation practices, which again goes in a cyclical manner to inform the gender division of labor and climate change. So it's kind of a cycle, it's kind of a vicious cycle that goes on until we address that why several of these impacts are coming out as gendered, why is a certain category of people being affected more than the others, and until the time we can address that why these patterns are going to continue. So we see that climate change impacting on population that are most reliant on natural resources for their livelihood, or who have the least capacity to respond to natural hazards such as droughts, landslides, floods and hurricanes. And oftentimes we see that this least capacity to respond to natural hazards are often tied with the experiences of women. And as the UNDP highlighted, that women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change in situations of poverty, and the majority of the world's poor are women. So this is the one of the very important reasons why when there is a natural disaster, when there is a natural calamity, the higher number of people affected are women, because people who are living in poverty, people who are do not have access to resources or are denied access to resources will be affected higher in cases of climate change and natural disaster. And oftentimes this category of people comprises more women than men, and then then we have all these figures which show that why women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens. And we also see, as the UNDP points out, that women's unequal participation in decision making processes and the labor markets compound inequalities and often prevent women from fully contributing to climate related planning, policy making and implementation. So the idea of amplification, the idea of hearing more voices from women is not that significant yet in policy making, in policy implementation, or even before that in the decision making process. So we see that the idea of gender inequality gets translated to an inequality in terms of decision making process, inequality in terms of policy making, inequality in terms of implementation, and therefore inequality in terms of environmental impact on people. So this is this is a given that if the idea of gender inequality is not addressed to, as Amrita Sen pointed out, as I showed you in the first slide, that it just leads to several of these incidents, several of these events which can be a huge burden on one category of people in society, and there are repercussions, there are implications for those burdens. So we see that more and more societies are becoming aware of this this relationship between climate change and gender, and there has been a lot of political, socio-political activism and a lot of policy making and a lot of governmental effort to actually bring or bridge the idea of gender and climate change, and bring into the conversation that what can be done in order to eliminate gender inequality, or in order to address the environment through the gender lens positively. And this is a project by the International Association of Women in Radio and Television, or the IAWRT, who it's a contributory project where several directors have actually contributed, made little stories, documentaries on 5 regions across the world, on 5 women who have been at the forefront of these environmental movements, these environmental policies, addressing several of the world's environmental issues. And here we see the cases of the case of Norway, the Arctic oil exploration, that is led by a woman. We see the case of Maheshwari. So we see that this contributory documentary has showcased 5 different stories, 5 different environmental stories from across the world, and in each of the cases it's an environmental case that is a case of environmental degradation or a natural calamity or access to resources. Whatever is the story, it is at the forefront is the voice of a woman, and we see a variety of environmental concerns with actually being led here. So the first story we see, it's a campaign to prevent Arctic oil exploration in Norway. So this is led by Lundberg, who runs the only youth environmental organization to address the Arctic, the environmental degradation that the Arctic oil exploration brings to the coral reef in the world. The second story that we see is of Maheshwari, which is in the backdrop of the impacts of the cyclone in Thane, and she acts as a community leader here, who provides access to information to fishermen as they venture out into the sea for their work. So what she does is she delivers satellite information on weather conditions to the fishermen who are out in the sea, to ensure safety for these people in her coastal community, this is just a way to bring into focus that you do not have to wait for a natural calamity to happen. You can prevent it, or you can actually have access to the right resources, to the correct resources, and prevent a calamity. And this is one way where Maheshwari is actually addressing that. She's providing knowledge, she's providing information, satellite information on weather conditions to the fishermen out in the sea. The third story that we see is about climate change policies in Kenya, where this woman is training women farmers in sustainable practices, and this is just bringing in more women's voices in the policy making actions, something that the UNDP has highlighted, as you've just seen. The fourth story is about a researcher who is developing research methods in Quebec to share knowledge and ensure that research initiatives to address climate change take into account these most impacted. So basically, what are the newer ways, what are the improved ways to understand the nature of climate change around them, and how can you understand it better. And the fifth one is in the backdrop of the First Nations in Canada, which is this is again a policy intervention, and she's preventing efforts to build a tar sand pipeline across her community that threatens water security and contributes to global warming. So she's at the forefront of saving her community from a disaster, a human-made disaster of the environment, and this is one way she's channelizing voices in her community to prevent that disaster. So if you're interested, you can go take a look at this documentary, which is a very nice and comprehensive way of telling you the importance of gender in climate change. So then the question is, why gender in the development process and the environment? And as the UNDP has pointed out, that gender and the environment can be looked at from three different vantage points. The first one is the human rights perspective, and this is the perspective that deals with the idea of knowledge, power, the production of knowledge and power, access and implementation, and the idea of knowledge and technology. And as you have seen in the previous slide, that the situation, the environmental community action that Maheshwari is doing currently of delivering satellite information on weather conditions, is producing a new sort of knowledge, a new sort of power dynamic, and a new sort of knowledge about the use of technology, to prevent a natural disaster. And just at this point, it is important for us to clarify what is a hazard and a disaster. So a hazard, any natural calamity, say an earthquake or a cyclone or whatever, will not become a disaster if it doesn't affect a significant part of the population. But the moment it affects a significant part of the population, and we hear, you know, property damages, death rates, you know, soaring high. So the moment you know, a hazard affects a population, it becomes a disaster. And the human rights perspective addresses this you know, idea that how can we prevent you know, a natural disaster from happening. So if you have access to the right kind of knowledge, if you have, you know, the right sort of access to resources or power, and you have the opportunity to implement it, then there's a possibility that you can prevent a natural disaster. So that's the human rights perspective. The second perspective, which looks at the environmental rationale, is the cleaner, efficient technologies that we talk about all the time. You know, the ideas of sustainability, the ideas of reducing, you know, plastic wastes, and creating efficient technologies. So that is the environmental rationale. And the economic rationale talks about gender and formal labor, and this is an ongoing conversation that is, you know, transdisciplinary, and you know, it has its roots in multiple sources. So we can bring in the Marxist lens of understanding, you know, division of labor, or you know, ownership of property in society. We can you know, bring in the feminist lenses, the various feminist lenses, where we understand the division, the conceptual divisions between informal and formal labor, and how we understand gender in relation to formal labor. So this is the economic rationale, which talks about the gender, the idea of gender and formal labor in society. So formal labor is that category of labor which is accounted for, which is for which you are paid. And so you know, this is the you know, premise of the economic rationale. The idea that, you know, gender affects the environment and vice versa, that environment affects gender, can also be understood at the intersection of the discourses on gender, development and ecology. So we see that if you look at that history, since the age of the Enlightenment, we have, you know, come through ages of the scientific progress, you know, that, you know, the age of Enlightenment gave in, you know, to the to an acknowledgement to scientific progress and economic development. But with that idea also comes, you know, if you have to use a gender feminist lens, that, you know, so what happens when this becomes a post-colonial project, and how is the environment represented in this case? So is it still taken to be a model of progress? Is it still destruction of the natural economy? So how do we deal with it when we try to use a critical lens of understanding that social relation of between gender and society? And with that is very, very significantly tied the idea of the third world woman. So the idea of the third world woman, as you may recall, emerged as a category, emerged as a socioeconomic category out of the feminist movement, and this is really an economic division between the global south and the global north. And the third world women have been categorized in this case as you know, the most poverty struck, you know, the most you know, the category of women who have to work the most yet paid the least, and when there is a natural calamity, they are the affected the most. So this again comes from the development discourse, that the experiences of the third world women are definitely different from, you know, other categories of women, not to homogenize the rest of the categories of women, but then you know, this calls in for different modes of thinking. So it is not an unidirectional or a single framework that we can use to understand these experiences. So the modes of thinking and the action that pass for science and development need to be interrogated critically in this regard. So we see that not universal and humanly inclusive as they are made out to be, modern science and development are projects of male Western origin, both historically and ideologically. So the gender development ecology discourse actually points out that how we understand the modern science development project is as a male Eurocentric Western origin project historically and ideologically, and it is definitely not universal, it is definitely not humanly inclusive, and so we need to move beyond that assumed way of thinking, that assumed mode of thinking, to enlarge the idea so that it becomes more inclusive. So that has been one of the major calls from the gender development and ecology discourse in this regard. So we see that this idea of gender and the environment has been taken up at the international levels, and in the 1992 Earth Summit of Rio de Janeiro, it brought in a new discourse of environmentalism, and we see the inclusion of the idea of sustainability in this regard. So for the first time there is a refocusing on how we understand the discourse of environmentalism, and it shifted the prevailing discourse of staging environmental crisis to the idea of implementing long-term sustainability. So the focus of addressing the environment shifted from like addressing an environmental crisis to the idea of a preventive form of implementation of long-term sustainability. And a new equation of democratic praxis emerged as a result of the Rio Summit in 1992, which encompasses feminism, environmental justice, multicultural concern, and North-South conflict. So this, for the first time, brings into the focus the prominence of women and their experiences in the center stage of addressing front and center the ideas of feminism as it deals with environmental justice, multicultural concerns, and the North-South conflict. So this is the global North, global South conflict. So as you see that gender now is brought with this Rio Summit, gender is brought to the center, and there has been efforts, attempts to mainstream it in the understanding of the environment. So with that, we now transition to understanding another critical lens that is of use here, the idea of ecofeminism, and how does the discourse of ecofeminism or the theoretical framework of ecofeminism help us understand the relationship between gender and the environment. So if I can remind you from the feminism, the theories of feminism lecture, that we have talked about various frames of references and directions in terms of how the ideology or the frameworks of feminism grew, and we did look at 5 different frameworks in that regard, starting with the human emancipatory feminism, which talks about the placing of the human in the context of the society, and bringing in the talking about the human in the context of social relations. So placing the human at the center of the discussion. and it does talk about how power is expressed through the individual, but also there's a possibility that of a liberation and emancipation of the human being when power is not operative. So that is one of the starting points of the emancipatory feminism, which is going to be important for us to understand from where does ecofeminism come from. We also have seen that the second and the third reference points included attention to the biological differences or the sexual differences feminism that brought with it understanding of the different experiences, but then it remained limited to talking about the biological differences. The multiple differences or the race ethnicity paradigm of feminism talks about the inclusion of multiple variants, inclusion of multiple variables that inform the gender experiences, and that brought with it newer, more inclusive understanding of gender relations. And then we have the relational power framework, which talks about the various ways power can be organized or power can be negotiated within the feminism framework. And finally, the postmodern feminist framework, which talks about fluidity, which talks about instability, that these differences are constantly evolving and being negotiated every now and then. So it's kind of impractical or not possible to have a constant definition of these identities. So the idea of identities or gender identities keep shifting and they become relational, they become concepts of identification. So as you will see that the journey that ecofeminism has traveled has in the backdrop all of these frames of references, particularly the first three and the fourth one. So let me walk you through the ideas of emancipatory feminism one more time to give you a backdrop here, that this first framework of feminism came as a critique of liberalism in the 18th and the 19th century, and in the 1960s 70s the stronger criticism of the universal standard of liberalism came through, and the idea that power is owned by the dominant group was also in focus for emancipatory feminism. And we see that in this framework there was a faith in meta-narratives. So people started believing in these universal ideas, universal power geometries, universal experiences. So they started believing in these meta-narratives. Power was seen as domination downwards, so it was being used as from the oppressor to the suppressor, and the self as oppressed by social power was the guiding premise of understanding the human self in the emancipatory feminism model. So the term ecofeminism was coined in 1974, and it has traveled several paths. And some of the paths that we see in scholarship are the feminist study of history and political theory has informed the journey of ecofeminism over time. We see that some of the grand narratives were challenged by the emergence of the ecofeminism framework, and the idea of unequal power relations was revisited. So this formed the premise of from where ecofeminism comes from, and also the idea of the Marxist framework of wealth, property and class. So you know, these are some of the basic trends, some of the basic paths that we see in scholarship that ecofeminism has gone through. And important in this context is the emergence of the various feminism points of reference, the frameworks of reference, particularly in regard to history and political theory. And we see that the you know, there was a challenge or identification of the twin oppression of women and nature with dominance. Structures of patriarchal social conventions were challenged. So so oppression, you know, if we have to talk with the discourse of power, oppression was seen as a twin experience between women and nature. So you know, ecofeminists started arguing that you know, women were oppressed just as nature was you know, oppressed within the dominant structures, which is basically guided by patriarchal social conventions. So with that in background, we see that there were certain conceptual themes which emerged from ecofeminism, and it was seen that you know, in scholarship there was a split between humanity and nature in the understanding of humanity and nature, which informs the split between man and woman. So you know, these were seen as dualities, these were seen as binaries, and it was seen in comparison to each other, and of course there was implicit power dynamic at play. The dualistic power hierarchy, which was a logic of interwoven oppression. So this was forwarded by Plumwood in 94, that you know, oppression is interwoven in this you know, dualistic power hierarchy, and more scholars started to point out the interconnectedness of the you know, the premises of the building blocks of ecofeminism, that is energy, matter and reality, that you know, all of these are interconnected and they influence you know, people's experience, and you know, it's helpful to have a comprehensive and inclusive framework to look at this interconnectedness. So we see that Ralph Plumwood's ecofeminist analysis of the dualism, where you know, Plumwood talks about reason identified with masculinity, freedom, activity as human culture, as distinct from and superior to a feminized nature, which was imagined as passive and mechanical. So you know, nature here is again equated with female, and culture is equated with male, and this exists in the form of a duality, that you know, it's either one or the other, and you know, the idea of human culture was given a masculine form, a form which had freedom, and the idea of nature was given you know, a feminine form, and which was imagined to be passive, which was imagined to be mechanical. So there's a question of power and agency inherent in this understanding, in this assumption. And we also see Greta Gard's argument that ecofeminism acknowledges dualism as created by an oppressive structure, patriarchy, and seeks to transcend them. So you know, we see the starting point of ecofeminism, as the scholars point out, that there is a dualism, there is a difference, and this difference is between you know, male, female, culture, nature, and this dualism is born out of you know, an oppressive structure, which is often a result of patriarchal you know, structure, patriarchal hierarchy, and the idea of ecofeminism seems to, or targets to transcend this oppressive structure, transcends to you know, minimize and eliminate the oppressive structure, and you know, go towards a holistic model of understanding the gender environment debate. So some of the key characteristics of ecofeminism in this regard would be, first, to identify the connections between the domination and oppression of women and the domination and the exploitation of nature. So, as you have seen in the previous slides, I was talking about the twin oppression of women and nature, and ecofeminists tried to establish this connection between the domination and oppression of women with the domination and exploitation of nature. The next key characteristic feature that ecofeminism brings with it is that in patriarchal thought, women are identified as being closer to nature and men as being closer to culture. Nature is typically seen as inferior to culture. So again, this is the duality that I was talking about previously, that the duality is between culture and nature, and culture is often equated with male or masculine, and the nature is equated with female or feminine. And so this duality is something that ecofeminism seeks to address and bring out the inequality of power play from it. The domination of women and the domination of nature have occurred along similar trajectories. Therefore, women in healing the alienated human and non-human nature. So again, you see the ongoing relationship that has been leveled with the human and the non-human, and the equation that women share with nature in terms of exploitation, in terms of oppression, has been the guiding principles. The feminist movement and the environmental movement both stand for egalitarian, non-hierarchical systems, and this is what ecofeminism brings the two movements together, the feminist movement and the environmental movement, in terms of their shared principles, in terms of their shared ideology of standing for egalitarianism, of standing for non-hierarchical systems, of equal power geometries, and this is a blend between the two, the feminist movement and the environmental movement. And the two movements have to evolve a common perspective, theory and practice, as ecofeminism professes, in order to address, or in order to attain an egalitarian, non-hierarchical social system. So the ecofeminist discourse generally argues the connection between the exploitation of nature and the oppression of women. So if we have to go by the discourse of ecofeminism, this is what the discourse argues, that there is an existing connection between the exploitation of nature and the oppression of women. And there is the concept of dualism, as we have seen, between nature, culture, emotion, reason, however you want to describe it, as advocated by the ecofeminists. So the discourse revolves around the connection between exploitation of nature and exploitation of women, and the existence of the concept of dualism between nature, culture, between emotion, reason, as professed by the ecofeminists. So we have a concept of feminist environmentalism from Agarwal in 92, where she has articulated that women in poor households in India are victims of environmental degradation in gender specific ways. So she talks only about India, but if we broaden the aperture, if you look at the global scale, then it probably translates into similar experiences, that if women in poor households are victims of environmental degradation in very gender specific ways. And on the other hand, they have also been agents in the environmental protection movement, bringing in gender specific perspectives as alternatives. So on one hand, they have been victims of this environmental degradations, and on the other hand, they have also provided agency. They have also been active agents in protecting the environment and bringing in the specific alternatives. So when we're talking about the discourses of development, gender and the environment, we see that these three discourses of development, gender and environment have when put together, they produce certain common themes. So in terms of the environment and gender, so we see that the discourse of development and poverty talks about poverty reduction in development discourses, and it talks about the imagery and the indicators of poverty. So understanding poverty through the development lens. It also talks about women, not gender, at the core of poverty reduction policy. So as I just said that women are taken as agents of change. There is a discussion in this discourse about the productive and reproductive work, and there is a discussion about intrinsic value that is added to or inherent in the productive and reproductive work, and how gender as an empirical and analytical category has evolved over time in this respect, in the respect of the intrinsic value. So we see that over time there emerged a category of women in development, and we see that following the modernization theory and rooted in liberal feminism, as you know, and neoclassical economics discourses, suggested a focal shift from reproductive to productive work. And so if you recall a couple slides ago, we were talking about the idea of gender in formal labor. So this shift in focus from reproductive to productive work is along that line, and this just brings in more agency, more voice for women in creating environmental change. And the third idea that springs from this discussion is the idea of ecological modernization, which was seen as having some waves. It came in several trends. So the idea of ecological modernization came in the 1960s, where we see the first wave that was concerned with the degradation and pollution of natural landscapes, seeing nature conservation as the main policy response. So this was one of the earliest efforts to address the degradation, the pollution of the environment, and it was done, or it was attempted through many of the policy implementations, policy responses. In the 1970s, we see the second wave that was manifested in the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972, and environment and the development had to be addressed simultaneously. So as I was telling you in the previous slide, that the two discourses of environment and development merged, and this was the second wave that was seen, that was discussed in the UN Conference on Human Environment. And in the 1980s, we see the most influential of the waves, the third wave, which saw the publication of the politically commissioned report, which is called Our Common Future, by the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, where ecology and economy, so environment and economy, were integrated into a common frame that later became known as the ecological modernization. So that is how the discourse of ecological modernization comes in, through the integration of the ecological discourse and the discourses around economics, neoclassical economics. And it comes with an assumption that economic growth can solve poverty and environmental degradation. So this was the implicit idea in the idea of ecological modernization. And we see that with these waves of ecological modernization, environmental concerns were mainstreamed into modernization theory as the dominant development theory. So the growth of the idea of gender and the environment, sits at the intersection of these several discourses of environment, of ecology, of neoclassical economics, of modernization theory, and of development discourses. So you see that it comes from all of these sources, and ecological modernization has been one of the very significant facets in this regard. So, if you recall the 1960s, where the first wave of ecological modernization happened with an attention to degradation and pollution of the environment, we find the work of Rachel Carson, her very significant work of The Silent Spring, where Carson revealed the unregulated use of DDT and other pesticides by the chemical industry. And there's also very important gender component here, that this was one of the first female voices we were hearing on protecting the environment. And Carson couldn't get a PhD in biology, because of the overburden of jobs and family responsibilities. So so we see that again this power geometry, the power dynamics come into play when we talk about gender, and in this case with regard to the environment. So Carson's voice is one of the first earliest voices that we see in relation to the first wave of ecological modernization. We also have the case of Jane Goodall, who is a British primatologist and anthropologist and studies social and family interactions of wild chimpanzees. So this is another significant female voice that we have seen addressing the requirement to study the environment, study the human environment relationship, and she has been quite a significant figure in this respect. And then we have, in the South Asian context, we have Vandana Shiva, where we have, she comes from a she's a physicist, so she comes from a physics background, and she has been a food advocate and an environmentalist, and over time she has pioneered a national movement, Navdanya, to protect the diversity and integrity of living resources, especially native seeds, and to promote organic farming and fair trade. So we have seen Vandana Shiva's contribution to the promotion of organic farming, and if you're in, so in 2010 we see that Forbes magazine identified her as one of the 7 most powerful women on the globe. So it's quite a significant voice when we talk of gender and environment, particularly in the context of South Asia, but not restricting to it. And if you're interested, there is a documentary film on Vandana Shiva's work, so please go and take a look at it for further information. So this is, again, I'm revisiting an idea that I have talked about previously but briefly, is the idea of the ancient Indian worldview of the Prakriti, of the creation of the feminine principle from which life arises, and that has influenced a lot of the women's ecology movements, feminist movements around the environment over time, and it's crafted, it's premised on non-gender based ideology of liberation of the humankind. So we have one of the earliest movements, the Chipko movement, in the context of South Asia. And in current times we have the case of Piplantri in Rajasthan, which is a small rural setting in Rajasthan, where when a girl child is born, as a celebration of that birth of a girl child, the villagers of Piplantri actually plant 111 saplings, 11 trees, to celebrate the birth of a girl child. So now imagine, for every girl child, if you plant 111 trees, then what kind of an environment, what kind of a ecological system are you going to produce for that community. So this is a classic. So Piplan 3 actually gives us a classic, intersection between cultural preferences, understanding cultural preferences, understanding the role of gender in influencing environment. And just because that area of the country is so plagued with an cultural assumption of preference for a boy child, for a son, so just to prevent the ill practices of infanticide and female feticides, this is how they have integrated the idea of promoting a cultural value with creating a healthy environment. So this is one of the very recent examples that sits at the intersection of gender, environment and cultural preferences. So here you can see a very brief and quick image of the various socio-environmental movements that took place in India, from the Chipko movement to the Narmada Sagar Dam movement, to the Apipko movement in the south, to the Silent Valley movement again in the south, and the Rural Women's Advancement Society in the east. So you see that over time there has been ongoing dialogues of saving the environment or addressing environmental issues through the lens of gender, oftentimes through voices of women. And in closing, I want to quickly share here that some of the glimpses from rural parts of the country, where women bear greater responsibilities of crop and food production and preparation for developing world. And here you see glimpses from the western part of India, and this is based on some primary research, that we see that rural Indian women are embedded in nature and they perceive environmental destruction in very gender specific ways. So it is not surprising that the impacts of environmental degradation is falls on them as gender specific. So in closing, we have the idea of environmental justice in this regard, which is the movements to address the unequal distribution of environmental benefits and hazards across population groups, especially by race and or class. So again, this is an ideological movement or a policy level movement that brings into focus the third and the fourth framework of feminism, if you can recall, that multiple differences, the differences that bring out is brought out because of differences in race, class, caste, etc., and the various power negotiations that is produced with it. So the environmental justice movements address the unequal distribution of the environmental benefits and hazards across these population groups by intersectional analysis. So I want to close with again a reflective question for you. So how does the understanding of concepts of ecofeminism alter understanding of gender and space and place? So there's a very intricate relationship between the ideas of ecofeminism and understanding how spaces are gendered, how spaces are places are or gendered places are created. So I want you to reflect on that. If you are interested in further reading, please read Vandana Shivas and Maria Miaz's Ecofeminism. And in the next lecture, I will take up the issues of gender and globalization or international relations. Thank you.